They sit in their gleaming canteens and laugh at our ghost stories. They read our intercepted broadcasts about vampires, zombies, and men who turn into beasts under a full moon, and they click their mandibles in amusement. To an alien empire built on logic, humanity is a species terrified of its own imagination. They think we are soft. They think we are children. But they stop laughing when their veterans speak. Because the veterans know the truth. Our myths aren't fiction. They're a warning. The air in the lower deck cantina of Sector 4 tasted like recycled breath and ionized copper. It always did. The station's life support scrubbers were ancient, whining with a high-pitched mechanical stutter that dug into the back of Arthur's skull. He sat in a corner booth, nursing a glass of synthetic whiskey that smelled like nail polish remover, trying to massage the cramping arch of his left foot without taking his heavy work boot off. Around him, the mess hall was a sea of chitin, scale, and slate-gray skin. The Korvath dominated the space. They were a bipedal race, standing a head taller than the average human, covered in interlocking plates of keratin that clattered when they moved. To Arthur, they looked like a cross between a praying mantis and a Komodo dragon, and they smelled like dry dust and burnt sugar. Tonight, the burnt sugar scent was thick. It was their pheromonal equivalent of drunken amusement. A group of fresh Korvath infantry, barely out of their molting phase, their armor plates still carrying a naive, glossy sheen, were gathered around a metal table 2 booths down. They were passing around a battered human datapad, a piece of salvage likely bought off a black market scrapper. "Listen to this," one of them clicked, his mandibles vibrating as the translation collar at his throat spat out flat, synthesized English. "The dominant predator in their nocturnal cycles is a creature of their own species that ceases to possess a pulse. It subsists entirely on the iron-rich fluid of its kin." The table erupted in a cacophony of hisses and jaw clicks. The sound was like handfuls of gravel being thrown against a tin roof. "A dead thing that hunts," another young soldier mocked, slamming his heavy 3-fingered hand on the table. The metal dented slightly. Flesh without a circulatory system decomposes in 70 cycles. The biomechanics are impossible. These humans frighten themselves with biological paradoxes. "And here," the first one continued, swiping a claw across the cracked screen. "A virus that reanimates the deceased. They walk with rotting muscles to consume brains. They call them zombies. They dedicate thousands of hours of visual media to this impossible scenario." More laughter. A sharp, grating sound. Arthur took a sip of his terrible whiskey. It burned a slow, ugly path down his throat. He didn't feel a surge of patriotic anger. He didn't feel the urge to stand up, flip a table, and defend his species' honor. He just felt tired. The blister on his heel was weeping fluid into his sock. His lower back ached from spending 12 hours crawling through the maintenance shafts of the station's tertiary plasma manifold. He was 34 years old, and he felt 50. Let them laugh, he thought, staring at the condensation pooling at the base of his glass. Let the bugs think humans were just a bunch of soft-skinned apes scared of the dark. It was better that way. It was safer when they thought you were weak. "They are prey," a third Korvath chimed in, leaning back and crossing his massive armored arms. "Only prey obsesses over being eaten. When the High Command finally orders the subjugation of their sector, they will break before the first orbital strike. A species that invents monsters to justify its cowardice has no stomach for real war." The cantina door slid open with a heavy pneumatic hiss. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop. The burnt sugar smell of amusement vanished instantly, replaced by a sharp, acrid scent like static electricity. Arthur looked up. Standing in the doorway was General Toril. He didn't wear the ceremonial armor of the High Command. He wore standard scuffed infantry plating, heavily scarred by kinetic impacts and plasma burns. Toril was old. His plates had lost their dark luster, fading to an ashy, dead gray. His left arm was a crude cybernetic prosthetic, a heavy mass of pistons and raw servos that lacked the elegant plating of newer models. But it was his face that demanded silence. Half of his mandibles were missing, melted away into a smooth, ugly scar of slick tissue, leaving his jaw permanently crooked. The cantina went dead quiet. Even the humming of the life support scrubbers seemed to apologize for making noise. Toril walked slowly toward the bar. His heavy boots thudded against the grating. Clunk, whir, clunk, whir. The servos in his fake arm engaged as he reached out, tapping a single coin onto the counter. The bartender, a nervous, multi-limbed Xeno, hastily poured a dark, viscous liquid into a steel cup and pushed it forward. Toril turned. His single good eye, a deep, unblinking yellow, swept over the room. It landed on the table of young soldiers. "You find the Terran mythologies amusing, Sub-Commander?" Toril's voice was a low, mechanical grinding sound, filtering through a heavily modified vocal translator. It didn't have the flat inflection of the standard models. It had a gravelly, resonant weight. The young Korvath, who had been holding the datapad, swallowed hard. His throat plates clicked nervously. "General, we were merely observing their cultural texts, their obsession with the impossible, dead things that fight. It is structurally illogical." Toril took a slow sip of his drink. He didn't look away from the young soldier. "Illogical," Toril repeated softly. The word hung in the stale air. "You think they invent these creatures because they are afraid of the dark?" He set the steel cup down. It made a dull thud that echoed in the silent room. "They do not invent them to frighten themselves, Sub-Commander," Toril said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that carried across the entire mess hall. "They invent them so they have a name for what they have to become when the dark comes for them." Arthur stopped rubbing his foot. His stomach gave a sudden cold lurch. He knew exactly where this was going, and a part of him wanted to stand up and walk out. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to remember. Toril moved away from the bar, his heavy, limping gait carrying him closer to the center of the room. The young soldiers instinctively pulled back, pressing themselves against the cheap synthetic leather of their boots. "You have never fought them," Toril said, his gaze drifting up to the dim overhead lights, as if seeing something projected onto the rusted metal panels. "You only know the simulations, the tactical readouts. You look at their biology, fragile endoskeletons, unprotected organs encased in soft flesh, a reliance on constant hydration and atmospheric pressure. You see a weak vessel. You see meat." Toril raised his cybernetic arm, the servos whining, and pointed a heavy steel finger at the young soldier. "I commanded the 3rd Vanguard during the Siege of Harvest. It was an agricultural colony, insignificant. We dropped onto the Western Hemisphere during their monsoon season. The sky was the color of bruised flesh, and the rain never stopped." Arthur closed his eyes. Harvest. Just the name made his nostrils flare. He could suddenly smell it, not the ozone of the station, but the thick, suffocating stench of rotting vegetation, wet cordite, and copper. The mud on Harvest didn't just cling to you, it swallowed you. "Our strategy was simple," Toril continued, his translation collar capturing the grim cadence of his clicking tongue. Shock and awe. We are Korvath. We fight with precision. We strike hard, break the enemy's command structure, and the rest surrender. That is the logic of war. Toral let out a sound that the translator struggled with, a broken, wheezing hiss. It took Arthur a second to realize the alien was laughing. It was a terrible, hollow sound. We shattered their defensive lines in 3 cycles. We bombed their communications relays. We cut off their supply lines. By all tactical doctrines in the known galaxy, the war was over. We waited for the surrender. Toral took a step closer to the young soldiers. But the surrender never came. Instead, they retreated into the mud, into the ruins of their cities, and the war changed. The veteran closed his single eye for a fraction of a second. You mock their ghost stories. You laugh at the dead that walk. Let me tell you about the dead. The canteen was so quiet, Arthur could hear the erratic pulse of his own heart. He wrapped his hands around his glass, feeling the cheap plastic warp slightly under his grip. He had been a combat medic on Harvest. He had been 22. He remembered holding a boy's intestines in with his bare hands while the rain washed the blood away faster than it could pool. He remembered the boy asking for his mother, and then, 5 minutes later, asking for a rifle. We advanced on a ruined processing plant, Toral said, his voice lowering, forcing the entire room to lean in. We had bombarded it for 12 hours, thermobaric charges. Nothing biological could survive the concussive waves. We sent in a clearance squad to secure the perimeter. Toral tapped his scarred chest plate. My squad, 30 elite infantry. As we breached the rubble, the mud shifted. The corpses we had stepped over began to rise. One of the young Korvath soldiers scoffed, a tiny nervous click. A mechanical trap. Automata. No, Toral snapped, his eye flashing with sudden, violent intensity. Flesh and blood, humans. They had buried themselves beneath the corpses of their own dead to shield against the thermal blasts. They breathed through hollowed-out reeds in the mud. They lay in the rotting mass of their kin for 12 hours, waiting for us. Toral's metal fingers twitched. They were deafened by the bombs. Their eyes were bleeding from the overpressure. Half of them were missing limbs. They had no heavy weapons, only kinetic rifles packed with dirt and sharpened pieces of metal. They should have been dead. Their bodies were failing. But their eyes... Toral paused. He looked down at his mechanical arm, staring at the exposed wiring. Their eyes were blank. The fear was gone. The logic was gone. They did not fight to win, Sub-Commander. They fought to ensure we bled with them. They threw themselves at our plasma lines. When their weapons jammed, they used rocks. When their hands were burned away, they used their teeth. They tore the feeding tubes from our armor. They drowned my men in the mud, holding them down while they themselves were being shot to pieces. Toral looked back at the table. I watched a human take a plasma bolt to the center of his chest. It burned a hole the size of my fist through his sternum. I saw his lungs blacken. The pain should have forced his nervous system into immediate collapse. It is biologically mandated. Arthur swallowed. His throat felt like sandpaper. He remembered the stimpaks, the reckless, horrifying cocktails of adrenaline, combat amphetamines, and localized pain blockers they pumped into the infantry. It didn't heal them. It just turned off the brain's ability to realize the body was dead. He did not collapse, Toral whispered. He fell to his knees, coughing blood that boiled as it hit the air. And then he looked at me. He smiled, a terrifying, wet baring of his blunt teeth. He pulled the pin on a fragmentation grenade and crawled toward me. He crawled for 20 meters, dragging his dying body through the slick mud. He didn't make a sound. He just kept coming. Toral touched his ruined jaw. That is how I lost this. He detonated himself against my Vanguard shield. He died, but he took 4 of my brothers with him. The silence in the room was absolute. The young Korvath soldiers were rigid, their earlier bravado completely stripped away, leaving only the confused, instinctual tension of prey. Arthur felt a cold sweat breaking out on the back of his neck. His hands were trembling. He hated this. He hated the way Toral spoke about it, elevating the sheer, desperate butchery of humanity into some dark mythology. It wasn't glorious. It was ugly. It was the frantic thrashing of an animal caught in a trap, chewing off its own leg to escape. But Toral wasn't finished. The old general leaned heavily against the edge of the nearest table, his good eye sweeping the room, demanding the attention of every alien present. "You read their texts," Toral said, gesturing loosely toward the discarded datapad on the table. "You read about vampires, creatures that drain the life from others to sustain themselves. During the 4th month of the siege, our supply lines were severed by their orbital debris fields. We were starving. We were dying of infection." Toral's voice grew rhythmic, almost hypnotic. "We captured a human forward operating base. We found their medical tents. They had no synth blood left. They had no advanced trauma units. Do you know what we found?" No one answered. The room barely breathed. "We found humans with tubes jammed into their own veins, pumping their blood directly into the bodies of their wounded comrades. They were draining themselves white, willingly inducing hypovolemic shock, just to keep their fighters standing for one more cycle. They were feeding off each other to stay alive." Arthur remembered the dim, flickering lights of the triage tent. He remembered the hollowed-out faces of the volunteers. "Take a pint, Doc. I don't need it today. I'm just on radio duty." He remembered the cold clinical reality of weighing one life against another, turning healthy men into pale ghosts so the grunts could go back out and hold the line. "And the beast men," Toral said, his translator buzzing with the strain of his rising volume. "The ones who transform under the moon. You think it is a child's tale." Toral pushed off the table, standing to his full, imposing height. "In the final days, they ran out of ammunition. They ran out of stims. We cornered an entire battalion in the ruins of their capital. It was a night cycle. The sky was clear for the first time in months. The moon of that cursed planet was full and bright." Toral pointed at his chest, tapping the armor right over his primary heart. "They attached bayonets to empty rifles. They wrapped their hands in barbed wire, and they charged. They didn't shout war cries, they howled. A primal, guttural noise that shook the dirt under our feet. They threw away their tactical discipline. They discarded everything that made them a civilized, spacefaring species. They devolved right before our eyes into apex predators." Toral's metal hand gripped the back of a chair. The metal groaned and bent under the pressure. "We broke. We had superior numbers, superior weapons, and unbroken armor. And we broke because you cannot fight an enemy that has already accepted death. You cannot terrify a species that keeps its worst nightmares in a mirror." Toral let go of the chair. He looked exhausted, the adrenaline of the memory draining out of him, leaving only an old, broken soldier. "Do not laugh at their myths," Toral said quietly, turning his back on the young soldiers and facing the rest of the cantina. They are not stories of what lives in the dark. They are blueprints. When a human is pushed past the breaking point, when you strip away their comfort, their logic, and their hope, they look into their history and they become the monsters they invented. Toral began a slow, limping walk toward the exit. As he reached the pneumatic doors, he stopped and looked back over his shoulder. Pray to whatever gods you hold that the High Command never orders a full war against Terra. Because if we push them into the dark, the things that come back out will not stop until we are all dead. The doors hissed open, and Toral stepped out into the corridor. The door slid shut behind him, sealing the cantina in a heavy, suffocating silence. No one moved. The young soldier stared at the table, the datapad sitting there like a live explosive. In the corner booth, Arthur finally let go of his glass. His knuckles were white. He looked down at his own hands. Soft skin, blunt nails, fragile bones. He didn't feel like a monster. He just felt sick. He felt the phantom ache of the shrapnel he had taken in his shoulder, and the lingering awful memory of the copper smell of blood in the mud. He didn't feel proud of what Toral had said. He felt deeply, profoundly sorrowful that humanity had to be so terrifying just to survive. Arthur grabbed his heavy work jacket off the seat beside him. He needed to get out of here. He needed to go back to his cramped bunk, lock the door, and try to sleep without dreaming of the rain. As he stood up, his boots clunked heavily against the floor grates. Every single alien head in the cantina snapped toward him. The Korvath soldiers looked at him. They didn't see the tired mechanic with a weeping blister. They didn't see the middle-aged man nursing cheap whiskey to dull a backache. Arthur looked back at them, his face impassive, his eyes dead and tired. The aliens slowly, carefully averted their gaze. The smell of burnt sugar was entirely gone, replaced by the faint, sour stench of adrenaline. They were terrified. Arthur zipped up his jacket, ignoring the silence, and walked out into the corridor. The corridor outside the cantina was a long, ribbed tunnel of scarred aluminum and flickering halogen strips. The lights hummed with a low, erratic frequency that made Arthur's teeth ache. The air out here was colder, scrubbed of the cantina's organic stench, leaving only the sterile bite of industrial ozone and leaking coolant. Arthur walked with a deliberate, heavy limp. He didn't try to hide it anymore. With the Korvath soldier's eyes burning a hole in his back until the doors sealed, he had maintained a rigid, steady posture. But now, alone in the gray hallway, he let his body sag. The blister on his heel felt like a hot coal pressed against his skin with every step. He hated this station. Outpost 42G was a refueling hub hanging on the edge of neutral space, a rust bucket held together by duct tape, cheap sealant, and the sweat of 1,000 different species who had nowhere better to be. It was loud, it was dirty, and it was anonymous. That was exactly why Arthur had signed a 5-year contract to crawl through its guts, fixing plasma manifolds. Anonymous was safe. Anonymous meant nobody asked you about the war. Until tonight. He swiped his greasy key card over the optical reader of his quarters. The lock groaned, a rusty protesting sound, and the door slid back just enough for him to squeeze through. His room was a closet. A metal slab folded out of the wall served as a bed, covered by a thin, scratchy thermal blanket. There was a sink that spat brown water for the first 3 seconds, a locker that wouldn't close properly, and a ventilation grate that constantly leaked a smell like burning hair. It was cramped, suffocating, and perfect. Arthur dropped his jacket onto the floor. He sat heavily on the edge of the metal slab, leaning forward to unlace his boots. His hands were still shaking. He stared at his fingers, thick, calloused, permanently stained with dark engine grease around the cuticles. You cannot terrify a species that keeps its worst nightmares in a mirror. Toral's mechanical voice echoed in the small room. Arthur let out a short, harsh breath, a bitter sound that held no humor. "Bullshit," he whispered to the empty room. He finally got the left boot off. The sock was soaked through with sweat and a dark yellowish fluid. He peeled it away, wincing as the fabric pulled at the raw, exposed dermis of his heel. It was a nasty blister, angry and inflamed. He reached under his bed and pulled out a battered first aid kit. As he dabbed antiseptic onto the wound, the stinging pain grounded him. It cut through the rising fog in his head. The aliens always got it wrong. They looked at human history, at the blood and the mud and the desperate, savage things humans did to survive, and they called it strength. They romanticized it. They thought the beast men and the vampires Toral spoke of were conscious choices, tactical evolutions born of some inherent, terrifying warrior spirit. They didn't understand that it was just sheer, blind panic. Arthur taped a gauze pad over his heel. He remembered the boy in the triage tent, the one who had asked for his mother. Arthur had given him a heavy dose of morphine. Too much probably, but the kid's lower half was crushed under a collapsed prefab wall. There was no saving him. The kid had stopped screaming, his eyes going wide and glassy as the opiates flooded his system. "I'm not scared, Doc," the boy had slurred, his lips pale blue. "I'm gonna be a ghost. I'm gonna haunt the bastards." He died 3 minutes later. He didn't become a ghost. He became 60 pounds of rotting meat that Arthur had to drag into a mass grave the next morning because the air scrubbers in the med tent had failed and the smell was making the surgical team vomit. There was no glory in it, no terrifying metamorphosis into apex predators. They hadn't fought with rocks and teeth because they were brave. They did it because they were trapped, starving, and their brains had short-circuited from the trauma. Toral's vampires bleeding themselves dry for their squad mates weren't heroes. They were broken kids suffering from severe psychological trauma, making irrational choices because the chain of command had disintegrated. Arthur stood up, his bare foot slapping against the cold grating. He walked over to the sink, turned the tap, and let the brown water flush out before splashing the cold, chemical-tasting liquid over his face. He looked at himself in the scratched metal mirror above the basin. Dark circles carved deep valleys under his eyes. His skin was pale, his hair thinning and gray at the temples. He was 34, but the eyes staring back at him were ancient. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the absolute bottom of the barrel of existence and found that the barrel had no bottom. He wasn't a monster. He was just tired. He was so incredibly tired. He tried to lie down. He pulled the scratchy thermal blanket up to his chin and stared at the dark ceiling. He focused on the hum of the station. "Listen to the reactor," he told himself. "Listen to the steady, logical pulse of the machinery." But the machinery sounded too much like rain. Every time he closed his eyes, the gray metal ceiling dissolved into a sky the color of bruised flesh. He felt the dampness seeping into his bones. He smelled the wet cordite. He heard the wet, sucking sound of boots pulling out of deep mud. Squelch, squelch, squelch. Arthur threw the blanket off. It was no use. Sleep was a hostile territory tonight. He grabbed a fresh pair of socks from his locker, pulled them on, and forced his foot back into the heavy work boot. He laced it up tight. embracing the sharp sting of the blister. He needed to work. He needed to burn out the adrenaline and the ghosts with brute, physical labor. He picked up his tool belt, heavy with sonic wrenches, plasma torches, and diagnostic scanners, and headed back out into the corridor. The tertiary plasma manifold in Sector 7 had been running a 3% variance for a week. The station chief didn't care, but Arthur did. 3% was sloppy. 3% meant something was grating against something else. He would go fix it. He would bury his hands in grease and scalding pipes until his muscles screamed louder than his memories. Sector 7 was the station's bowels. It was a labyrinth of heavy conduits, steam vents, and cramped crawl spaces. The air down here was easily 40 degrees Celsius, thick with humidity and the acrid stench of hot metal. Arthur wedged himself into a narrow gap between a primary coolant line and the hull plating. The heat radiated through his thick canvas jacket, instantly soaking his shirt in sweat. He engaged the magnetic clamps on his boots to keep from sliding down the curved interior hull, and leaned awkwardly to reach the pressure valve of the manifold. It was pitch black, save for the narrow beam of his shoulder-mounted work light. The beam cut through the dusty air, illuminating the rusted, stubborn bolt he needed to turn. He attached a heavy, long-handled sonic wrench to the bolt. It was old tech, stripped of its digital assist, requiring pure mechanical leverage. Arthur gritted his teeth, braced his good leg against the coolant line, and pulled. The wrench didn't budge. He readjusted his grip, his greasy gloves slipping slightly. He breathed in the hot, dead air. He thought about the young Korvath soldiers laughing in the cantina. He thought about Toral's ruined face. He thought about the mud. He pulled again, putting his entire back into it. The muscles in his shoulders burned. The bolt groaned, a high-pitched metallic shriek. Crack! The wrench slipped. Arthur's momentum carried him forward, and his knuckles slammed violently into the jagged edge of a mounting bracket. "Son of a bitch!" he hissed, dropping the wrench. It clattered down into the darkness below, bouncing off pipes until the sound faded. Arthur pulled his hand back. A deep gash tore across his index and middle knuckles, welling with dark, thick blood. He pressed his thumb against the cut, feeling the hot sting. He leaned his head back against the vibrating hull, closing his eyes and letting out a long, ragged exhale. "Your structural engineering is as stubborn as your biology." Arthur's eyes snapped open. The voice was a low, mechanical grinding sound, completely unsuited to the tight confines of the maintenance shaft. It resonated off the metal walls, making the hairs on Arthur's arms stand up. He twisted his neck, aiming his shoulder light down the shaft. Standing on a catwalk 20 feet below, looking up at him, was General Toral. The old Korvath's massive, armored frame barely fit on the narrow walkway. In the harsh, directional beam of Arthur's light, Toral looked like a machine of war that had been abandoned in a junkyard. His dull gray plating absorbed the light, and his single yellow eye glowed with an eerie, reflective luminance. Arthur didn't move. He kept his thumb pressed against his bleeding knuckles. "You're a long way from the officer's deck, General." Toral grasped the ladder leading up to Arthur's access point. His cybernetic arm whirred loudly as he began to climb. The metal rungs protested under his immense weight. Clunk. Whir. Clunk. Whir. Arthur watched him ascend, his heart rate picking up. There was nowhere to go. He was wedged between two pipes. If the alien wanted a piece of him, Arthur would have to try and burn him with a pocket plasma torch. It wouldn't end well. Toral reached the level just below Arthur, stopping where the shaft widened slightly. He looked up his ruined, crooked jaw illuminated by the worklight. The air between them was thick with heat and tension. "I prefer the lower decks," Toral said, his translation collar buzzing softly. "The air is honest. It smells of labor and decay. The upper decks smell of synthetic perfumes and political cowardice." Arthur wiped a bead of sweat from his eye with the back of his wrist. "What do you want?" Toral tilted his head. He inhaled deeply through the vertical slits on his snout. "You are bleeding." Arthur glanced at his hand. "Slipped on a wrench. It's nothing." "Copper and salt," Toral murmured. "It is a distinct olfactory signature. It cuts through the ozone." The alien paused, his single eye locking onto Arthur's face. "I smelled it in the cantina as well, though no skin was broken there. I smelled the sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline, the chemical marker of a cornered animal." Arthur stiffened. "I wasn't cornered. I was just leaving." "You were a medic," Toral stated. It wasn't a question. Arthur didn't answer. He just stared at the alien, the silence stretching out, broken only by the rhythmic thumping of the station's life support systems. "Your posture," Toral explained, leaning heavily against the railing. "Your eyes track movement differently than standard infantry. You do not look for the weapon first. You look at the center of mass, assessing the structural integrity of the target. You look at where they are broken. I learned to recognize the medics on Harvest. They were always the ones covered in the most blood, yet carrying the fewest weapons. If you're looking to swap war stories, General, you found the wrong guy," Arthur said, his voice flat and hard. "I fix pipes now. That's it." "I am not looking for camaraderie, human," Toral said, his mechanical voice dropping to a harsh rumble. "I am making an observation." "You made plenty of those upstairs," Arthur shot back, the anger finally bubbling up through the exhaustion. "You put on quite a show for the kids. The monsters in the dark, the vampires, the beastmen." Arthur let out a dry, hacking laugh. "You make us sound like gods of war, like we planned it all." Toral's mandibles clicked, a slow, deliberate sound. "You think I romanticize your suffering?" Toral asked. "I think you're full of shit," Arthur said bluntly. He didn't care if the alien was a general. Down here in the heat and the grease, titles meant nothing. "I was there, Toral. We didn't bleed each other dry because we were apex predators. We did it because your orbital strikes wiped out our medical supply drops, and guys were dying of shock from standard shrapnel wounds. We didn't howl at the moon because we devolved. We howled because our comms were jammed, and it was the only way to signal a retreat in the dark." Arthur leaned forward, pointing his bloody finger down at the towering alien. "We weren't monsters. We were terrified, starving, broken people trying to buy one more hour of life with whatever we had left. You turned our trauma into a campfire story to scare your recruits." Toral did not react with anger. He stood perfectly still, letting Arthur's words hit him. When he finally spoke, his voice was surprisingly quiet. "I know." Arthur froze. "What?" Toral raised his flesh hand, the heavy three-fingered claw gripping the metal railing. "I know it was desperation. I know you were not monsters. I read the intercepted medical logs after the siege. I saw the casualty reports. I know exactly how much your species suffered." Toral looked down at his own cybernetic arm. "But my soldiers, they do not know. The Korvath Empire is expanding. We are encountering dozens of new species. Most surrender when their mathematical probability of victory reaches 0. It is logical." Toral looked back up at Arthur, his yellow eye burning with a cold, absolute intensity. My species is arrogant. We rely on armor, on plasma, on tactical simulations. If they look at humanity and see only fragile, logical beings who suffered and died, they will view you as prey. They will underestimate you. And if the High Command ever orders an assault on a Terran core world, my soldiers will walk into the meat grinder expecting a quick victory. Toral stepped closer, closing the distance until Arthur could smell the dry dust and burnt sugar scent of the alien. I do not tell them the myth to glorify you, Arthur, Toral said softly, his translator barely picking up the whisper. I tell them the myth to keep them alive. I make you monsters in their minds, so they will never be foolish enough to push you into the dark again. Arthur stared at the old general. The anger drained out of him, leaving a hollow, aching emptiness. He looked at Toral's ruined face, the melted jaw, and the mechanical arm. He wasn't looking at a conqueror. He was looking at a survivor. Two dead men standing in the sweltering bowels of a forgotten space station, carrying the weight of a war nobody else understood. It's a heavy lie to carry, Arthur said quietly. Toral turned his head away, looking down into the dark abyss of the maintenance shaft. It is the only thing we have left to carry, the alien replied. He began to climb down the ladder, his heavy boots clanging against the metal. He didn't look back. Arthur watched him disappear into the shadows. He stood there for a long time, listening to the hum of the station. Finally, he looked at his bleeding hand, wiped the blood on his dirty canvas pants, and reached into his pouch for another wrench. There was a 3% variance in the manifold, and he had a job to do. It took Arthur 3 hours to muscle the variance down to a manageable 0.4%. By the time he twisted the final locking collar into place, his arms felt like they were packed with wet sand. The gash on his knuckles had stopped bleeding, sealing itself beneath a crust of dried blood and industrial grime. He climbed down the access ladder, his boots slipping twice on the rungs. His blister had finally popped. He could feel the raw, slick friction against the back of his heel with every step. He didn't care. The physical pain was a localized, manageable thing. It was a math problem with a clear solution. You step, it hurts. You step again. It was far easier to deal with than the quiet, creeping thoughts Toral had left behind in the dark. Arthur bypassed his quarters and headed for the commercial ring on level 2. The lights were dimmer here. Half of the halogen tubes burnt out and left unreplaced by station administration. The air smelled of cheap frying oil, unwashed bodies, and the sharp chemical tang of illicit dermabond. He pushed through a heavy vinyl curtain into a narrow stall, sandwiched between a noodle stand and a scrap merchant. "We're closed," a voice grunted from the shadows. "It's Arthur, Garrett. Turn the damn lamp on." A desk lamp flickered to life, casting a harsh, conical beam over a scratched steel table. Garrett sat behind it, a half-smoked cigarette dangling from his lips. Garrett was a relic, a former fleet surgeon who had lost his license somewhere out in the Perseus Arm and ended up stitching lacerations for ration chits on Outpost 42G. His hands shook slightly when he wasn't working, but his eyes were sharp. "You look like hell, Artie," Garrett rasped, tapping an ash onto the floor. "And you smell like a burnt alternator." "I need a patch," Arthur said, extending his hand into the light. Garrett leaned forward, inspecting the jagged tear across Arthur's knuckles. He didn't flinch. He just sighed, the cigarette bobbing in his mouth. "You didn't clean this. It's full of graphite dust." "That's why I'm paying you." Garrett pulled a rusted tray from under the table. It was filled with a haphazard collection of tweezers, biofoam canisters, and surgical tape. He poured a generous splash of rubbing alcohol onto a coarse cloth and grabbed Arthur's hand. "Brace," Garrett warned. He scrubbed the wound hard. Arthur sucked air through his teeth. The alcohol bit deep, a searing, white-hot line of agony that spiked up his forearm. He forced his hand to stay flat on the table, gripping the edge with his thumb to keep from pulling away. "Deep one," Garrett muttered, tossing the bloody cloth aside. "Gonna need sin thread. Biofoam won't hold if you keep punching bulkheads." "It slipped," Arthur said, his voice tight. "Sure it did." Garrett threaded a curved needle with a length of black synthetic fiber. "You know, the Korvath have a medical kiosk 2 levels up. They dip you in a gelatin vat, and the skin knits on a cellular level. No scars, no pain. Cost you half a week's pay, but it's civilized." "I don't like the vats," Arthur said, staring at the needle as it pierced his skin. He felt the tug, the slight resistance of his own flesh, and the sharp pinch of the knot. "They make me feel like I'm drowning," Garrett grunted softly, tying off the first stitch. "You and every other vet on this rust bucket. You'd rather sit here and let an old drunk sew you up like a torn pair of pants. Humans. We love our scars. We think they buy us something." "They don't buy us shit," Arthur muttered. "They remind us we're not machines," Garrett corrected, pulling the second stitch tight. "The bugs, the scales, the squids, they fix themselves so perfectly they forget they were ever broken. A human breaks, and they heal ugly. We carry the damage. It changes the structural integrity." Arthur thought of Toral's ruined face, the melted jaw. "I tell them the myth to keep them alive. Maybe Toral wasn't so different. Toral wore his damage on the outside. He used it as a shield." "Done," Garrett said, snipping the thread. He slapped a square of gauze over the knuckles and wrapped it tightly with white medical tape. "Keep it dry. If it starts smelling like sweet almonds, you've got gangrene, and I'll have to chop the finger off." "Thanks, Garrett." Arthur dug into his pocket with his good hand, pulling out 3 plastic ration chits, and dropped them on the table. "Get some sleep, Artie," Garrett said, turning the lamp off and plunging the stall back into shadows. "You look like a ghost." Arthur walked back out into the concourse. The ache in his hand was sharp and rhythmic, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. He felt marginally better. The pain was a tether, keeping him grounded in the present, away from the rain of harvest. He finally made it back to his quarters. He didn't bother taking his boots off this time. He just collapsed onto the metal slab, pulled his jacket tight over his chest, and closed his eyes. The exhaustion finally overrode the adrenaline. The station's hum faded. For the first time in weeks, he didn't dream of the mud. He dreamed of absolutely nothing. The klaxon woke him like a physical blow. It was a harsh, oscillating shriek that rattled the metal walls of his quarters. Arthur jolted upright, his heart kicking against his ribs like a trapped bird. Disorientation hit him first, the panic of a waking soldier. His hands instinctively scrambled across the bare mattress, searching for a rifle that hadn't been there for a decade. He blinked hard, forcing the cramped gray walls of his room into focus. It wasn't an orbital strike. It was a station emergency alarm. The overhead comms crackled, spitting out a synthesized, multilingual warning. "Critical failure in Cargo Bay 4. Hull pressure breach imminent. Containment protocols initiated. All non-essential personnel evacuate the sector. Cargo Bay 4. That was 3 levels down, right above the primary docking rings. If they lost pressure there, the cascading failure could rip the entire lower quadrant of the station apart. Arthur threw his legs over the edge of the bed. His body protested violently. His back seized, and his freshly stitched hand throbbed. He should stay here. He was non-essential personnel. He was a mechanic, not a damage control team. Let the automated bulkheads do their job. Let the security teams handle it. You do not look for the weapon first. You look at where they are broken. Arthur swore, a vile, breathless curse. He grabbed his heavy tool belt off the floor, slung it over his shoulder, and hit the door release. The corridor was chaos. Aliens of various species were pushing past each other, heading for the central stairwells. Arthur went the other way, shoving his shoulders through the crowd, ignoring the panicked clicks and hisses. He reached the service elevator, ripped the access panel off, and manually bypassed the safety lockout, sending the cage plummeting down to level 5. The doors groaned open, and the noise hit him like a wall. Cargo Bay 4 was a cavernous expanse of steel decking and stacked shipping containers. The air was thick with gray smoke and the acrid smell of burning insulation. A massive overhead cargo crane had sheared off its rails. The multi-ton gantry lay crumpled across the deck, crushing a row of pressurized shipping crates. Klaxons screamed. Sparks showered from severed power cables dangling from the ceiling. A squad of Korvath security personnel had already arrived. Arthur recognized the glossy armor. It was the same young soldiers from the cantina. They were standing behind a perimeter of deployable energy shields, their kinetic rifles drawn, shouting conflicting orders into their comms. They looked terrified. "What's the status?" Arthur yelled, jogging up behind them. The sub-commander spun around, his kinetic rifle twitching nervously. He saw Arthur and froze, his mandibles parting in sudden recognition. It was the human from the bar, the quiet one. "Civilian, you must evacuate," the sub-commander clicked hastily, his translator buzzing with static. "The gantry collapse has compromised the external airlock seal. The structural struts are failing. In exactly 4 minutes, the bulkhead will breach, and this bay will depressurize." Arthur looked past the energy shields. He saw the massive steel gantry pinning the airlock door half open. Beyond the door, the warning lights of the decompression chamber were flashing red. The hissing sound of escaping atmosphere was getting louder. "Where is the heavy lifter drone?" Arthur demanded. "It is stuck under the debris," the sub-commander replied, pointing a clawed finger. "We have requested a breach team from High Command. They will arrive in 10 minutes to cut through the debris." "The bulkhead fails in 4, you idiot," Arthur snapped. "Protocol dictates we maintain a safe distance until heavy machinery arrives," the Korvath insisted, his voice rising in defensive panic. "We cannot move the gantry. The mass is mathematically impossible for biological units to shift." Arthur ignored him. He ducked under the energy shield and ran toward the wreckage. "Human, stop!" the sub-commander yelled. The heat near the collapsed crane was blistering. Arthur coughed as the chemical smoke burned his lungs. He reached the crushed airlock door. The gantry beam was pinned diagonally across the locking mechanism. If the door didn't seal, the vacuum of space would suck the entire bay out into the void. He heard a sound, a wet, frantic wheezing. Arthur dropped to his knees and looked under the steel beam. Pinned beneath the crushing weight was a station worker, a scrawny, four-armed Talarian. Its blue skin was pale, its lower thorax completely crushed. It was drowning in its own fluids, clawing weakly at the deck plating. Arthur's chest tightened. He smelled it. The copper, the sweat, the urine. It was the smell of the triage tent. It was the smell of a bad death. "Hey," Arthur grunted, sliding onto his stomach and reaching his hand under the beam. He grabbed the Talarian's upper hand. "Look at me. I've got you." The alien's large black eyes rolled toward him, filled with blind, suffocating terror. Arthur looked at the gantry beam. It weighed easily 3 tons. The Korvath were right. It was mathematically impossible. He couldn't lift it. You cannot terrify a species that keeps its worst nightmares in a mirror. Arthur let go of the alien. He stood up. He unclipped the heavy 3-foot solid steel pry bar from his tool belt. It wasn't meant for lifting. It was meant for aligning engine mounts. He wedged the flat edge of the pry bar under the lip of the gantry beam, resting the fulcrum against a solid rivet on the deck plating. He wrapped his hands around the top of the bar. His newly stitched knuckles screamed in protest. Arthur looked back. The young Korvath soldiers were watching him from behind their shields. They were perfectly still, their kinetic rifles lowered. They were watching the myth. Arthur didn't feel like a myth. He felt like a tired, broken man who was about to destroy his own spine because he couldn't stand to watch someone die in the dark again. He planted his boots. He took a deep breath of the smoke-filled air, tasting battery acid and ozone. He pulled down on the pry bar. Nothing happened. The steel bar bent slightly. Arthur closed his eyes. He stopped thinking about the math. He stopped thinking about the pain. He visualized the boy on Harvest. He visualized the mud. He reached deep down into the ugly, bottomless well of trauma that he spent every waking second trying to ignore, and he let the lid off. A primal, guttural noise ripped out of his throat. It wasn't a heroic shout. It was an ugly, animalistic growl of pure, unadulterated desperation. He threw his entire body weight onto the bar. He leveraged his hips, his back, his shoulders. He felt the stitches on his knuckles tear open, wet heat spilling over the steel grip. The muscles in his lower back seized, a blinding flash of agony shooting down his legs. His vision went white at the edges. The blood vessels in his eyes throbbed, threatening to burst. More. Give it more. His boots slipped on the bloody deck, but he caught himself, driving his heel into the grating. The gantry beam groaned. Behind the shields, the Korvath sub-commander stepped forward, his jaw dropping in horrified awe. With a deafening shriek of tearing metal, the gantry beam shifted. It scraped upward, sliding just 3 inches up the airlock door. It was enough. "Pull him!" Arthur roared, the veins in his neck bulging, blood dripping steadily from his hand onto the deck. "Pull him out!" 2 of the Korvath soldiers broke formation. They sprinted forward, diving under the suspended beam, and grabbed the Talarian by its arms. They dragged the crushed alien out from under the weight. The second they were clear, Arthur let go of the pry bar. The beam crashed back down, missing Arthur's boots by millimeters. The airlock door, freed from the diagonal pressure, slammed shut with a massive pneumatic hiss. The locking bolts engaged. The flashing red lights turned solid green. The depressurization stopped. Arthur collapsed backward onto the deck plating. He lay there, staring up at the smoke-filled ceiling, gasping for air. His lungs burned. His back was locked in a spasm of agonizing pain. His right hand was covered in fresh blood. The white tape soaked through. The Korvath soldiers surrounded him. They didn't speak. They looked at the 3-ton beam. They looked at the bent steel pry bar. And then they looked down at the fragile, soft-skinned human lying in the grime. The scent of burnt sugar was completely gone. The air was flooded with the sharp, sour stench of absolute terror and reverence. "You," the sub-commander whispered, his mandibles trembling. "You moved it." Arthur turned his head slowly. He looked at the young alien. He tasted copper in the back of his mouth. He didn't feel like a beast man. He didn't feel like a god. He just felt nauseous. "Yeah," Arthur wheezed, closing his eyes and pressing his bloody hand against his face. "I moved it. Now get a medic. My back is killing me." Arthur woke up drowning. He thrashed instinctively, his eyes snapping open to a blinding, sterile white light. Thick, viscous fluid coated his face, filling his nose and mouth with a taste like cold peppermint and sterile alcohol. Panic, raw and instantaneous, seized his chest. He kicked out, his boot striking something solid and smooth. "Calm yourself. The oxygenation cycle is complete." The voice was synthesized, flat, and entirely unbothered. Arthur broke the surface, gasping violently. He wiped the thick blue gel from his eyes, coughing up a mouthful of the fluid. He was sitting in a sunken, tub-like diagnostic bed. He wasn't in Garrett's dingy stall. The walls here were seamless white polymer, the air perfectly temperature-controlled and devoid of any smell. It was the Korvath medical ward. He grabbed the edge of the vat and pulled himself up, the gel sloughing off his canvas clothes in heavy, wet sheets. He looked down at his right hand. The blood was gone. The grease was gone. The ragged, jagged tear across his knuckles and Garrett's crude black synthread stitches were completely erased. In their place was a stretch of smooth, flawless pink skin. It didn't even look like his hand. It looked like a mannequin's appendage, freshly molded and bolted onto his wrist. He flexed his fingers. There was no pain. None at all. He swung his legs over the side of the vat, his boots hitting the pristine white floor with a wet squeak. He tested his back. The agonizing spasm that had dropped him in the cargo bay was a ghost. The Korvath microsurgeons in the jail had repaired the micro tears in his lumbar muscles, flushed the lactic acid, and realigned his vertebrae in less than 2 hours. Arthur felt a sudden, intense surge of nausea. It was too perfect. It felt like a lie. He ran his left thumb over his unblemished right knuckles, pressing hard, trying to find a ghost of the ache. Nothing. They had taken away the damage, and in doing so, they had taken away the proof that he had survived it. Your biology is highly receptive to cellular regeneration. Arthur looked up. The young Korvath sub-commander was standing by the sealed door of the medical suite. He had removed his helmet, revealing a pale, angular face with restless, clicking mandibles. He wasn't standing at attention. He was leaning slightly against the bulkhead, watching Arthur with an unblinking, unsettling focus. "Where is my tool belt?" Arthur rasped, his throat still coated in the minty slime. It was contaminated with biofluids and corrosive chemicals. It has been sent to decontamination. It will be returned to your quarters. The sub-commander hesitated, his clawed fingers twitching at his side. The Talarian worker. Its lower thorax was crushed, but the station medical algorithms indicate a 70% chance of survival. Because you extracted it before the bay depressurized. Arthur grabbed a sterile white towel off a nearby rack and started scrubbing the gel out of his hair. Good. The silence stretched. Arthur focused on drying his jacket, deliberately ignoring the alien. But the young Korvath didn't leave. He took a slow step forward, his boots clicking softly on the pristine floor. "The gantry beam," the sub-commander said, his voice dropping in pitch. "I accessed the station's manifest. The tensile weight of that beam was 3.4 metric tons. I cross-referenced this with Terran biological parameters. The maximum load capacity of a human male of your height and density, even under extreme adrenaline stimulus, is roughly 500 kilograms. Arthur threw the damp towel onto the diagnostic bed. "Math is just theory until you test it." "It is not theory," the sub-commander insisted, his translator buzzing with the strain of his confusion. It is physics. You lack the bone density. You lack the muscular leverage. The fulcrum point you established was insufficient. By all known universal laws of mechanics, your spine should have snapped, and the bar should have slipped. Arthur looked at the young alien. He saw the same terrified awe he had seen in the cantina, but now it was personal. It wasn't a story on a datapad anymore. It was real, and it was standing right in front of him, smelling like cheap mint gel. But it didn't, Arthur said flatly. Why did you do it? The sub-commander asked, his mandibles vibrating in a rapid, erratic rhythm. The Talarian was not of your species. It was not of your clan. The mathematical probability of your own death was absolute. Why would you knowingly initiate an action that guaranteed your destruction? Arthur walked over to a sink mounted in the wall and turned on the tap. Real, clear water came out. He rinsed his mouth, spat into the basin, and looked at the alien's reflection in the mirror. Because you didn't, Arthur said. The sub-commander stiffened. You stood behind your energy shields, Arthur continued, turning around and leaning against the sink. You calculated the mass of the beam. You calculated the time until the bulkhead failed. You looked at the math. You decided it was impossible, and you waited for the heavy machinery. You made the logical choice. Arthur looked down at his flawless, unscarred hands. Humans don't have the luxury of logic, Arthur said softly. When we are pushed into a corner, when the math tells us we are dead, we don't accept it. We cheat. We break ourselves in half just to spite the numbers. I didn't lift that beam because I'm a monster, or a beast man, or some apex predator. Arthur pointed a finger at his own chest. I lifted it because I couldn't stand the thought of listening to that worker suffocate in the dark while a bunch of kids in shiny armor did nothing. The sub-commander looked away, his posture sagging slightly. The absolute certainty of his military training was fracturing. He was realizing that true terror didn't come from biological paradoxes or the undead. It came from a species that looked at an impossible, lethal wall and decided to headbutt it until either the wall broke or their skull did. You may return to your quarters, mechanic, the sub-commander clicked quietly. Your vitals are stable. Arthur didn't say another word. He walked past the young soldier, the pneumatic doors hissing open to let him out into the cold, ozone-scented corridor. Arthur didn't go back to his quarters. He went to the level 4 observation deck. It was a deserted, narrow gallery overlooking the station's massive exterior fuel silos. The viewport was a thick slab of reinforced quartz, scratched by micrometeorites and stained with cosmic dust. Outside, the endless, indifferent black of space stretched out, speckled with the cold light of distant, unnamed stars. He leaned against the railing, staring out into the void. His body felt light, foreign, and deeply wrong. He missed the ache in his back. He missed the sharp, grounding sting of the blister on his heel. The perfect health the Korvath had forced upon him felt like an invasion. A heavy, irregular footstep echoed on the metal grating behind him. Clunk, whir, clunk, whir. Arthur didn't turn around. You owe Garrett 3 ration chits. He did a perfectly good job on those stitches. General Toral came to a stop beside him. The old alien looked even worse under the harsh fluorescent lights of the observation deck. His gray plating was dull, his cybernetic arm leaking a tiny drop of hydraulic fluid from an overtaxed servo. He placed a familiar, unlabeled glass bottle on the railing between them. The dark, viscous liquid sloshed inside. The medical bay reported a complete cellular regeneration Toral said, his mechanical voice low and grinding. You possess no permanent tissue damage. They erased it, Arthur said, his voice bitter. He picked up the bottle, uncorked it, and took a long drag. The synthetic whiskey burned like battery acid. It was exactly what he needed. He wiped his mouth and handed the bottle back to the alien. I liked the damage. It was mine. Toral took the bottle. He tilted his ruined, melted jaw back and poured a measure of the dark liquor down his throat. The sub-commander filed his incident report, Toral said, looking out at the stars. He detailed the structural failure of the gantry. He detailed the imminent depressurization. And he detailed how a single, unarmored Terran mechanic leveraged 3.4 metric tons of steel to save a dying laborer. Toral looked at Arthur, his single yellow eye catching the ambient light. He noted in his report that Terran biological constraints are highly variable under stress. He recommended that all tactical assessments regarding human physical limitations be revised upwards by a margin of 400%. Arthur let out a harsh, empty laugh. Great, so I proved your ghost story right. You did, Toral agreed softly. The rumor is already spreading through the garrison. They are calling you the Steel Breaker. They say your species possesses a latent kinetic density that activates when death is imminent. They are terrified of you. Arthur shook his head, staring down at his hands gripping the railing. I tore my back muscles to shreds. I ripped my knuckles open. I almost blinded myself from the blood pressure spike. It wasn't a superpower, Toral. It was suicide. If those bolts on the floor hadn't held the pry bar, I'd be a smear on the deck right now. But they held, Toral said, and you moved the steel. The old general leaned his heavy, mechanical arm on the railing. The servos whined in protest. I told them the myth to keep them from starting a war they could not finish, Toral murmured, his gaze drifting out to the dark expanse. You provided the proof. They will not laugh at your ghost stories anymore, Arthur, because they have seen the ghost. Arthur looked at the battered alien. He saw the missing mandibles, the dead gray armor, the tired yellow eye. Toral was carrying the weight of his entire empire's arrogance, trying to steer them away from the meat grinder he had survived. It's a hell of a way to keep the peace, Arthur said quietly. Peace is always built on terrifying lies, Toral replied. He pushed off the railing, leaving the bottle of whiskey sitting on the flat metal beam. Keep your head down, mechanic. Do not give them a reason to test the myth again. Toral turned and began his slow, limping walk back toward the elevators. Clunk. Whir. Clunk. Whir. Arthur stood alone on the observation deck for a long time. He drank the rest of the terrible whiskey, letting the burn settle in his stomach. He looked down at his perfectly smooth, unblemished hand. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, sharp sonic scraper he used for cleaning carbon deposits off valves. He pressed the edge against his right palm, gritted his teeth, and pulled it across the skin. A thin red line of blood welled up. The sharp, localized sting cut through the numb perfection of the medical gel. Arthur let out a long, slow breath. The pain was real. It was his. He slipped the scraper back into his pocket, wrapped a dirty piece of cloth from his jacket around his palm, and turned away from the viewport. The tertiary manifold in Sector 7 still needed checking. It always did. He walked out of the observation deck, his heavy boots clanking against the floor grates. As he passed a group of Korvath engineers in the corridor, they immediately stopped talking. They pressed their backs against the bulkhead, averting their eyes, giving him a wide, respectful berth. Arthur didn't acknowledge them. He just kept walking, pulling his jacket tight against the chill of the station. A quiet, tired man going back into the dark. If you loved this story, hit the like button and share it with your friends. Do you think humanity's greatest strength is our ability to survive the impossible, or the scars we carry to prove it? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on the best HFY sci-fi stories on the web. We upload new, gritty, action-packed tales every week. Support us to keep these stories coming. Stay strong, stay human, and see you in the next video.